it is at the top of the summit that Mihira is chosen to become the aspect of justice. And that is when, as far as that, we get this horrific image that we see in her card.
Yeah. So we reference this episode a lot because we like it a lot. If you've listened to our Annie episode, you know what magic does to pregnancies. Welcome to Casuals of Runeterra, episode 125. I'm your host, Ryan. Here with the other host, Edge.
And we have a very enlightened and justified episode for you today.
Whoa, slow down.
Listen, or ignore it at your own risk.
Listen here, mortals. The most important episode just dropped. Yeah, we're talking about Kayle Day. Homekeeping. Housekeeping. Shout out to my Family Guy watchers. Oh, geez. Housekeeping.
Maybe I stay and watch. Maybe I join.
You can listen to us everywhere. Email us at podcastcore@gmail.com. This is your first episode. We're sorry.
We're so sorry. But also, this is what you're in for.
Yeah,
this is about as honest as we can be.
Remember, that's COR.com for all of our info. And then follow us on all the platforms because we appreciate it. And it helps us with discoverability. Remember, it's grassroots, baby. Leave a like and comment. And the easiest way is word of mouth. That's what's gotten us here. So you can tell a friend to never judge a book by its cover by listening to the Casuals of Runeterra podcast.
And oh boy, I like how you say you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, we talk about probably the two characters that you can totally judge by their cover. But hey, what do we know? What do we know?
Yeah, right. The aspect of injustice. See, we're also dealing with the demographic of Hetch here, where when he sees a woman in goth makeup, he doesn't have the thought that she's bad. He has the thought that she's good. So he's kind of a skewed audience.
I'm sorry. Like, you say skewed, I say correct.
Yeah, he sees Morgana, he's like, oh, what an angel. And it's like, Hetch, that's not the common.
I mean, she's definitely more of an angel than Kayle. That's for damn sure.
You see, audience? You see, listeners, what I'm talking about? He's broken. Let's start with the spell.
I'm correct, not broken.
Celestial Impact is a 7-cost slow spell that says obliterate a unit or landmark. Heal your Nexus 3. We care about none of that. It's too expensive. What we care about is the quote here, which is, who would arrive in our hour of need? And that's from a Shuriman Elder. So it's simple, but the reason it's important is because thematically, what we're about to talk about, you could see how a place like Shurima that has to deal with Darkens, the Void, Corrupted Ascendants, would turn to any figure to assist them in their time of need. And we say that because as we talk about Kayle a little bit later here, not your first option for someone you want to help you when you need some power on your side.
Yeah, I like, especially once we get like deeper into the Kayle story, it's kind of like that the concept of like calling the police on your neighbors.
Oh my God, so correct.
Because there are times where you let emotions rule and maybe you make the call and then all of a sudden you're paying a ticket for some stupid fine because of like the where you park your car, right? Yeah. Like it's something dumb, and that's what Kayle is to this universe. But obviously, like the Shurimans, like they don't have a choice. They're beset on legitimately all sides the ground is against them.
Nature itself is trying to consume us. It's like Arizona. Nothing should be built there.
It is built in hubris against the gods. But I will say that, don't write this card off if you're playing in not the standard format and you're a Lux player. Because this will create a laser. But yeah, otherwise you're right. Like we don't need this card. What's our next card?
Our next card is the Fire Angel Mommy herself, Mahira, Aspect of Justice. So Mahira, you look at the picture of this card, you're like, what the fuck is that? It is the true form of an angel, by definition, if it was drawn. But it fits very well into the story because Hetch will talk about, Mahira, who is the mother of Kayle and Morgana. But the quote here is what matters because this reinforces what we spoke about earlier. It says, let me talk about the card. It's a 5-cost 1/1. It has round end, grant allies in play and in hand +1. Strong ability, that's why it's a 1/1. And then when it has empowered 5. So empowered 5 is once the creature's power matches the number next to empowered, that triggers additional abilities. So here the additional abilities are it gains elusive, lifesteal, and overwhelm. And once I read this quote, you could probably see, if you want to go real deep, how these empowered keywords kind of play into the theme of the character itself. Some revere the aspects as gods. Others see them as messengers from the realm beyond. Still, others fear them, and perhaps rightly so. And this is from lore keeper Skeen, or Skyen. We're gonna go with Skyen. Because there is a comma there.
All right, Skyen. Yeah. But yeah, like the card itself is, kind of it's kind of chill. Like the empowered mechanic is fun to play around with, but it's not super strong.
Yeah.
Because when they're not empowered, we're looking at a 1/1 that you spend 5 mana on. So, hello, Static Shock. But that aside, we're going to really dive into as kind of more of what the aspects, the beginning of the aspects, as far as like the history of Runeterra, kind of set themselves as, because the only aspect we've really talked about in detail has been Pantheon. We talked a little bit about Taric, but we've got some more Taric stuff possibly down the road. But when looking at Pantheon, Pantheon is like, yeah, that's a guy that's a god, right?
Yeah.
Like that's as Greek Roman god as you can get, comes down and he's here to fight for the mortal man. Hell yeah. So why would you be afraid of an aspect? And to learn why you would be afraid about an aspect, let's talk about Kayle.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, so the
aspect of injustice.
Yeah, so to talk about Kayle, we have to go a long way back. So this is I think this is like right after the Runic Wars.
Yes.
Or if it's not that, then it's like right at or during the Runic Wars.
Yeah, it's kind of rough because we recently did our Rise episodes, if you haven't listened to those, and not that Kayle appears in any significant form, but he does use the assistance of the aspect of justice from time to time as he's traveling around gathering runes. So the existence and when things are happening is a bit muddled. Also because Kayle is an OG character as well.
Yes, but we do know that they do interact at some point due to the fact that it's even in the animations of Runeterra. When you flip over Rise, Kayle is right there. Mm-hmm. So we do know that Rise was around possibly before Kayle, but who knows? Either way, we're going way back in time at the beginning of our story, and this takes place at Mount Targon. And so at Mount Targon, we have a couple that's climbing the mountain, and that is Mihara and Kilam. So we just talked about Mahira, and Kilam is her husband, and they are climbing Mount Targon in hopes of reaching out to the Celestials for guidance or for additional power to protect their village and their home. Right? This is very Targon-esque.
Yeah.
Like, look at any of our other Targon episodes, and it's something similar is going on. The the big twist here is that on their journey, Mihira realizes that she is pregnant. But despite this realization, she just digs in and decides to keep moving forward to save their home. So they do make it to the top of the summit, and it is at the top of the summit that Mihira is chosen to become the aspect of justice. And that is when, as far as that, we get this horrific image that we see in her card.
Yeah. So we reference this episode a lot because we like it a lot. If you've listened to our Annie episode, you know what magic does to pregnancies.
What, are you saying something like happened like wrong with Annie? Are you suggesting she's just not a perfect little girl in her own way?
Listen, I'm saying that some people use fertility drugs to assist themselves. Others use magic, and one is drastically different than the other.
Drastically different. But so now that Mihira is the aspect of justice, she does become a very renowned warrior. They now have the power needed to save their home. So despite being pregnant, she goes out, she fights, defends her home, and then, down the road after a proper amount of time, she gives birth, but she gives birth to twins. And the firstborn is Kayle, and the secondborn is Morgana. And it's even written that Kayle was as bright as the sun, just as much as her sister was as dark as night. So they came out of the womb yin and yang, essentially. Like they are polar opposites.
This all lines up to, we talk about like the early history of Shurima / Icathia, right? And we're looking at the early history of Targon pre-Lunari Solari, right? So it makes sense, and even to the point where we're about to talk about the early days of Demacia, which is to the south. So it's all of this is taken thematically and applied to this pregnancy, which is also very cool, right? Because we know how important Morgana and Kayle are to the overarching, celestial fight stuff of Runeterra. So this is neat. This is a good. It's very on the nose, right? It's very simple to see, but that doesn't make it any less cool.
Yeah, I mean, but you need to have that simplicity for the foundation.
Every story can be complicated and nuanced.
Yeah, but this is the foundation of the complications and nuances that we get later on when we get the Solari and the Lunari, because this is happening long before any of that.
Yeah,
because we're way back in time, and to start building that foundation, the husband Kilam is like, "Yo, it's great. I'm so happy we have our beautiful daughters, but you are the strongest warrior in all of the land. And now all the strongest enemies are looking for you, Mihira. So I'm going to get the kids out of here. Like I'm going to go." And he decides to cross over the Conqueror's Sea to a land that is protected naturally from magics. So if anybody who's listened to our Demacia episodes, which we might have a few of because one of the hosts here loves Demacia, no telling who, this may start sounding like, hey, is he going to the Petricite Forest? And that's 100% where he's going. Right? But at this time, the Petricite Forest, a place where magic is devoid, and this is a very young Runeterra as far as historically, it's not really a place that's been settled heavily because a lot of people have access to magic at this point of history. So he goes somewhere that is essentially very remote, but it's also, and not only is it remote, it's a place that the most powerful people of society in the world avoid because their powers don't work there. And it is here that he decides to raise his daughters, and the older they become, the more different that they become. So, and I even put in my notes that Kayle and Morgana, they are the yin and yang.
Yeah.
But despite the fact that they're yin and yang, we're only going to be focusing on like Kayle's childhood here.
Yeah.
So Kayle is when she becomes a teenager, she is very precocious. She is constantly butting heads with the village elders, constantly butting heads with any authority figures, but not necessarily because she's rebellious. It's because she is enforcing the laws that are in place over them. So, like she is the Karen of the subdivision. She's over there going, you can't park your car on this side of the curb. There's a sign here that says that. I need you to move your car. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're with the HOA. Move your car.
Yeah, let's put it this way. People like this, you technically don't want in positions of power because of it's interesting how this is written, because usually a normal person who has this self-imposed sense of justice and power is problematic, but her sense of justice and power is kind of a birthright, which makes it different. So the way she's acting isn't out of place, right? It's kind of expected because she's the one who's a spitting image of her mother.
Yes. Not only is she the spitting image of her mother, but obviously, her father is going to be raising them on the story of what it was like, because, they're probably hitting ages where it's like, hey, where's mom?
Yeah.
And so he's going to be telling them stories about mom.
Yeah.
And mom is the aspect of justice. And it's like, oh, Kayle, you look just like your mother. And so kid's like, oh, justice.
Yeah.
I know what justice is.
I am the knight. I am.
And, luckily she's just a kid. So like being just a kid, it can't be, too bad. She doesn't have any power. So how does she get that power? So this is her life as far as most of her youth is just being the kid that is like gung-ho, I'm going to be a police officer when I grow up. And one day there's like, just a normal day, there's a beam of fire in the sky. And from this fire in the sky, a sword that is split in half falls into the ground in front of their home, right between Kayle and Morgana. And at this point, they are teenagers. So a teenage Kayle and a teenage Morgana. And I love this little clip here because I'm just gonna like condense it, and it makes it so comedic because Kayle recognizes that the sword is Mahira's sword. So not only is it Mahira's sword, but it's been split in half. So he immediately assumes the worst. He assumes that Mahira has been defeated in battle. So he is heartbroken and devastated. Kayle is like, this must be mom's sword. I've been chosen. At last, I have been given the powers to enforce what is right in the world. And she takes up half of the sword and immediately sprouts wings and becomes like the figure of like a Diablo angel, like an angel from Blizzard's Diablo. All right.
Yeah.
And then Morgana is standing there looking at Kayle, like bathing in the glory of her newfound justice, looking at dad, who is heartbroken on his knees and crying, and is just kind of like, well, I guess the other half's for me. I don't know what you want me to do. And she grabs the sword, and she too grows wings, except her wings are black, and she just turns into a goth mommy.
And real quick, a little bit of foreshadowing for those who have played the game or have seen art of Kayle. There are depictions of Kayle with both halves of the sword. We won't talk about that right now.
We won't talk about that yet.
We won't talk about that right now.
Because she has half a sword, all right? And half a sword is still more than what Riven has. All right, and so now...
Mathematically, yes. You are correct. The math checks out.
So now this is the point as far in the history of the land where Kayle and Morgana become the paragons of power for this new region of Runeterra. And it is under essentially like a worship of these two that we have a new kingdom being born in this land, and that kingdom is Demacia. So Demacia is officially born from this point, and Morgana and Kayle play very pivotal roles in the forming of this society, as well as being leaders within it. We're going to ignore Morgana's part for the sake of the story right now. So the only thing that I'm going to touch is that Morgana decides to help the sick and the enfeebled, as well as the outcasts. All right. And that's the last time we're really going to talk about her role here. Kayle immediately is like, cool, I am the police. And she forms herself as the police chief. But being the spitting image of her mother, as well as now having the power of essentially the aspect of justice, she becomes a very renowned warrior. And even though this is a Demacia that is brand new and they don't have all the traditions in place in present day Demacia, they still respect, any proud and powerful warrior, because any new kingdom needs to have a strong fighting force to defend whatever land they claim. So she immediately gets herself very high up the social ladder with her newfound powers, and does end up making a cult following around her, because of course you want to mimic the people that got you to the point that you're at. Unfortunately, if they're mimicking Kayle, they do kind of create a justicator force. And anyone who's listened to a single one of our Demacia episodes will be thinking of mage seekers, and you're thinking correctly.
I think people have, okay, first of all, once again, if this is your first episode, you may not be aware of our position on police forces. In history, both real and fictional. You may now know.
You have an idea.
Continue as you will.
So yeah, great people. Now, as far as with this cult following that Kayle has created, Kayle has always been very precocious. She is the Karen of the block.
Yeah,
and now she has the power of the police chief on top of being that person. So whatever law is now set is held very strictly, and the punishment is very harsh, and it's handed out by Kayle and her justicator force. And the only soft spot that she has, the only shred of humanity that she ever shows that's left, is towards her sister Morgana.
Yeah.
Now, again, Morgana is off doing her own thing, but doing her own thing and picking up the downtrodden in this police state means that she is, helping out mages. A lot of Kayle's followers don't like that. They want to get rid of it entirely. Kayle has a soft spot for her sister, doesn't want to interfere, so she wants Morgana to do her own thing, but she can't control everyone, because at the end of the day, she is a human that has the power of an aspect. She's not actually a god. So one of her followers, who turns out to be her right hand in the organization, a man named Ronus. So Ronus decides, you know what? If Kayle doesn't have the strength to do what is right, I will do it in her stead.
Ronus is a simp.
Definition of simp. He's
Every
in the
organization
dictionary.
has one.
Yeah, and he's got his picture next to the word simp in the dictionary. All right, like that's what Ronus is. So he's like, you know what? If Kayle can't do it, I'll do it for my queen.
Oh,
and
no.
he goes and tries to stop Morgana, and this ends up leading to Ronus's death. We don't know who killed Ronus. We don't know what happened, but we do know that Ronus wanted to lock up Morgana. He was not trying to kill Morgana. He was just trying to, enact the law. And Kayle sees a dead Ronus, and this is where we turn into an episode of The Boys. Because Kayle is not happy that Ronus is dead, and Kayle's reaction is entirely based on her emotional response to this news, and she goes on a killing spree. Yeah. So we're talking like we're talking like, laser beams shooting at random
It's not
houses.
nation level, but at this point in time, it might as well be for this town / village.
I mean, like off of the scale, you could say it's like Ruination-esque because Demacia is very small at this point. It's just collections of villages. Like, it's not an actual kingdom. So, it's like probably like close to 90% of this area is destroyed.
Yeah.
But in the grand scope of things, it's not a lot. But still, it's bad. It's not good.
It's very bad.
It's very bad. Just because it's a small town, you don't want 90% of the small town to die.
This is true.
So, and in the same thought of you don't want 90% of them to die, there's only one person powerful enough to try to deal with a rampaging Kayle.
Yeah.
And that's Morgana.
Mm-hmm.
So Morgana takes up to the skies because Kayle at this point is flying in the sky, enacting her judgment on everything. So Morgana takes flight and they end up having a bit of Sakuga up in the sky. And this goes on until they hear the death cries of their father, Kilam. So within all this wanton violence, their dad gets caught up in it. And Kayle finally snaps out of her reaction to fly down to see Morgana holding her dying father to witness his last breath. So no exchanging of words or anything. She just catches the final breath of her father that was basically killed in her own wanton violence.
Yeah.
And is heartbroken and realizing what she has done and realizing that, she is kind of, broken a law here. She decides to just leave. So she takes up the second half of the sword.
Anime running from your problems.
She would have been a great anime dad. A wonderful anime dad. But she of the sword that was left by their mom, and she takes to the skies, flies off into the horizon. She can see Mount Targon in her flight, and she decides, you know what, I am going to go to Mount Targon, and then it is there that I'm going to reunite with mom, because remember, she's convinced that mom's okay, and she decides to reunite with mom and try to learn what it means to be the aspect of justice. And whether or not she actually meets mom or not, we don't know. We just know that she goes off into the sunset, and Morgana as well decides to go off into the sunset in a completely different direction, because it's like, yo, that's heavy. This is ridiculous. So they both go their separate ways, and now they live in legend. We know that they exist, but we don't know where they are. And a lot of the depictions that we get in Demacian lore and Demacian art is based off of Morgana and Kayle. That's one of the reasons that gargoyles, cough, cough, Galileo, were created, is because they're winged protectors. And it's the winged protectors that gave birth to Demacia, despite almost ruining it. But that's for some people, they remember them as the protectors of Demacia's. Scant few remember the horrors that they brought. But either way, they're now revered, and they go off into legend, and everyone's just kind of waiting for the day that something will arise that dictates the need for the winged protectors to return. And that's where her story leaves off here.
Yeah, that's where, that's a very realistic part of the story at the end, where when so much destruction happens, who writes the history, and then what is written about the events, and the way it turns out, and what we know now, to the way Demacia turns out, and it as a flawed nation is established and grows from this type of beginning, makes complete sense.
Yeah, and like a lot of the flaws is going to really make sense because of how they got them. It's like, yeah, why are mage seekers so fervent, and why are they so gung-ho about their mission?
Yeah.
Oh, now I get it, because Kayle was ridiculous. Yes. But yeah, enough for his story. Let's talk about the card, because this is a card that I really enjoy while simultaneously thinking it's garbage. And if you disagree with me, hit us up at Podcast Core, because I would love to know how to play this correctly. All right, so Kayle is a 5-mana 1/5, and her ability is I have +1/+0 for each time an ally attacked with increased power. When I'm summoned, grant allies +1/+0. Now, as far as like the summoning being grant, that's actually kind of sick. Like it's really good as far as for go wide strategies. But she also has empowered 6 and quick attack. So
what? For real? They found a way to fucking put it on the card anyway.
Yeah, so like if you get like it was like we did it, we have a champion without quick attack, except it could give herself quick attack. But it's by far like the hardest hoop to jump through because that's +5. That's
there's a lot of hoops there.
That's a lot of hoops. And speaking of a lot of hoops, her level up is I have 11 plus power at round start. So it's not a thing. This isn't Magic the Gathering where you can hold priority in your upkeep and slam all of your burst speed buffs to level her up. Like that's hard. But just like in the game of League of Legends, her level up is terrifying. Because she then becomes a 2/6. We know she's not a 2/6. She's going to be a 12/6 at this point. And with quick attack and overwhelm, and I have +1/+0 for each time an ally is attacked with increased power. When I'm summoned or level up, grant allies +1/+1. And now she has empowered 16 double strike. So like if she flips, it's pretty much game over. I just don't see a world where anyone
flips. It's funny you
flips
mentioned Magic because if Magic had angels like Giselle and stuff like that had jumped through these type of hoops, they wouldn't be as dangerous. But they just give them the power. Kayle in this card game, you have to work for it.
You have to work really hard for it. And the times that I've tried to play around with this card, I usually will just end up dying or killing my opponent before I get to any of the fun stuff. Yeah. So who knows? But that we're not going to talk about that anymore. Let's talk about the flavor here.
Yeah. So before you hop into the flavor, we've talked about like our additional episodes. And for Kayle's release, a lot of cards have, you'll hear again, mentions from Lorekeeper Skaheen, and we may do an episode where we go through all of his comments, which would be cool, like the books of Lorekeeper Skaheen.
Yeah, because I mean, like especially a show like this, we're talking about the lore of this universe, so it would only kind of hurt us if we ignored a Lorekeeper. True. Despite the fact that he's not a champion, like we still want to know what he says. But speaking of Lorekeeper Skaheen, let's go to the front side of Kayle. And the quote here is, the Demacians know her as the Winged Protector, but those of us who live under the Vault of Stars in Targon know her as the Daughter of Justice, bearing divine purpose and a sword of starfire. And that is a direct quote from Lorekeeper Skaheen. And then on the flip side, we get another quote, and that is, we would surely know her to see her, should she ever return, but I worry there is little reason for her to do so, beyond a threat so dire that it requires her interference. And this, that kind of plays into like the attitudes of like those who kind of know the big picture, because this isn't like, like the real world where they have the internet and they can look up what's happening on the other side of Runeterra, right? But like those who know, it's like, like Kayle is a winged protector to some. Kayle is destructive to the others, but it's probably best if we never see her again, because if we have to see her again, what brought her?
It reminds us of, I mean, you brought up Pantheon, which is so great because we know that aspects vary across the spectrum. There's a lot of them, right? And they have different motivations, they have different purposes. And, Pantheon in life and in death, and then in life again, proves himself to be a man of the people. And for Kayle, she never does that, because the person that does do that is Morgana. Even though Kayle is, it's a case when you put a system above the people. And Kayle is a very systematic person. And becoming an aspect only intensifies that. So ultimately, people say, well, sometimes a system can do justice, but when it's purely in service of one and it has that much power, maybe it's best if we look elsewhere. Which brings us back to what we mentioned at the beginning with our spell, right?
Yep. And I don't know if I could put it any better. That's perfect.
All right.
And that's a reality of Kayle's story, but that is also her story. So if you liked it, please let us know. Like, hit us up at podcastcore@gmail.com. I can't wait to dive into more of this stuff, because like the birth of Kayle and Morgana is like one of my favorite tales.
It's been a while. If you go back to our old episodes, you'll see Hetch waiting is like, damn, I can't wait to do this tomorrow. Fast forward 3 million years.
Look, I've waited. I served my time.
I've done my time. So with that, as always, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. And we'll be back soon with the next episode.
Yeah, take care, everybody.